he did make the thing about the student loan forgiveness. I wrote a piece about that, by the way. It's over at Chapter and Verse. A lot of you liked the first paragraph. Every now and then I ask my husband, I'm like, not that, is he going to allow me to say it, but is this going to be okay to say? I feel like, can I say this? He's like, yeah. But I had the first graph of this piece, and you should read it because I get into the history of why student loans are as expensive as they are. So he made it kind of, it's the vote buying scheme. I said the new rule is that you can take out a loan for whatever you want and make everybody else pay for it. And it sounds selfish and irresponsible and thoughtless, but not if you call it magic. Student loan forgiveness. It's like putting a halo on a turd. It's just like it. Now, people don't remember that the takeover of the student loan industry happened all the way back in 2010. I've said this before, and some of you have asked, well, what do you mean? Well, it was the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act of 2010. And there was also stuff that was tucked away in Obamacare, and even before that, in 2009. There was stuff tucked away in Obamacare that laid some of the groundwork for these additional manipulations. And I have cited, Forbes had a piece, and I also got into the New York Times, and I got into the party votes of it because Democrats, this was something that they really wanted to do back in 2010. They wanted to basically, the way that student loans had been set up until that point, like you actually had competition between loan providers, right? There were a lot of protections for students, for borrowers. And in this, and it was called the Federal Family Education Loan Program, they, and Forbes actually broke down how they were promised that passing this, it was going to save a lot of money from the quote-unquote nonpartisan Congressional Budgetary Office. But the Budget Office, you have to remember, it only formulates the exact numbers you give it. So you can totally give it BS lies, and it'll formulate based on that. So it begs it begs the question because it assumes that the conclusion is true because all of the premises fed to it are true. So it begs the question. So Forbes argued that there weren't these enormous savings, but there were tons of risk that was baked into this. And as a result, they could not understand why anyone was promising that this was going to be in any way a savings. But they said that all the flaws were obvious. And they said that, it was a lot better before the government took it over. It's a pretty deep dive. So you definitely want to go read it. But the point is that up until that period of time, rather, there were competition between loan providers. There were protections that were included in this. You had consumer protections for student applicants, and then Democrats eliminated that with this law. They eliminated the competition between loan providers, and then they wanted this super swampy direct loan program. They wanted to make the government the sole originator and collector of all student loans. That's what they did. And when Democrats complain about the high cost of education, they're literally complaining about the votes they cast in 2010 because they overwhelmingly voted to support this. They wanted to consolidate total control of student loans at the federal level. And they obliterated all the consumer protections. And now what? Biden thinks that he can throw a few $1 billion as to buy votes in an election season, and that makes amends for 15 years of price gouging. That's the other thing. He sits here and goes on and on about price gouging inaccurately, but this is actual price gouging, and it was made possible by them. They made this possible. And you had the Supreme Court that ruled against the forgiveness. That's the thing. And I still think, too, it's so asinine for people to compare the student loan debt sharing program and PPP. And I was looking back at a lot of the PPP stuff. And first off, I think that comparing the two is a medical sign that your brain function has ceased. That's true. But the PPP thing was brought about, as I said before, by the government enacting eminent domain over all economic activity, thus resulting in PPP, right? None of it should have ever happened in the first place, but that's what happened. But with the PPP program also included restrictions for how the funds were to be received as grants. And provided you could get them as a grant and not have to pay it back if businesses if they maintained certain levels of employment. So you had to have some X amount of employees still. And if you got under that number, then you lost it and you lost your qualification for it and you had to pay it back. They had to continually meet those requirements. People who committed fraud, and they did use it as a slush fund. I mean, again, I don't think any of this should have ever happened, but the people who committed fraud are being prosecuted. I linked up a ton of cases for you that they've been going after recently. Student loan, quote unquote, forgiveness is just welfare for people who voluntarily signed up to assume this loan, and they're too responsible to pay off something like $12,000 in 10 years' time. What in the world? But as long as I had made the mention, as long as we're going this route, mortgages, we did that with mortgages. That was what too big to fail was. Remember, you had Democrats who decided that having criteria to meet to gain a loan was discriminatory. So they forced these financial institutions to reduce across the board criteria. They began giving high-risk loans to people who had neither the means or really intention to fulfill them. And then we ended up having this giant economic disaster. It all contributed to it. So we already did that with mortgages.